Good morning, everyone. This morning I'm going to talk about effective business analysis, and this is part of DevFacto's webinar series. My name is Cheyney Wagner. I'm a DevFacto consultant, and I've worked in software delivery for over 10 years. I started off as a developer, I moved into architecture, and more recently my focus has been on business analysis. So I wanted to talk about some of my more recent thoughts on business analysis and how to do it effectively. And I wanted to start off with a disclaimer of sorts that I'm not seeking to train anyone on proper, quote-unquote, proper business analysis. I'm not going to introduce any formal methodologies or even name any formal methodologies. This is meant to be just a very approachable and lightweight introduction to how you can, some easy practices you can incorporate into your projects immediately. So I have a simple agenda. I want to talk about three main points. Why? Why is effective business analysis important? How to perform effective business analysis? What methods can you use? And also, who does business analysis? And then we'll end with what to write down, what is the outcome, what are the artifacts of effective business analysis. Here's the obligatory rhetorical questions slide. And so this is in the voice of a software developer or a software delivery project team member. Stakeholders know what they want. We know how to build it. Can't we just get to it? They'll tell us what to build, we'll build it, and we'll move on to the next project. Well, that approach is fundamentally flawed in that it doesn't realize opportunity to deliver true quality. And software quality has a few different aspects, and I want to discuss what software quality is or what it can mean in order to help answer that question. So there's some things that people think of immediately when they're evaluating whether a piece of software is of high quality or not. Performance, availability, resilience is one of them. If the system is slow, or if it's down often, or if it can't be trusted to be available, that is generally and justifiably regarded as poor quality software. Another aspect of software quality is lack of faults. So the amount of bugs that's in the system. This is a very common metric, a very common way of thinking about quality, something that doesn't do what's expected of it, where errors occur or incorrect calculations or unpredictable results. That's also perhaps the most common measure of quality in people's minds. But I would argue that there's a much more fundamental aspect of quality, and that is the suitability of the software. You could call this the appropriateness of the software, whether it's fit for purpose, the functional value, but it all boils down to whether it was designed to do what it needs to do. The first two categories are all about doing things right, and the last category, the suitability category, is about doing the right things. And that might seem like a fine distinction, but it's actually fundamental to how you might think about this. So just in summary, performance, availability, is the software fast and reliable? That is important, but not as important as it doing what's expected, lack of faults. And again, that is important, but not as important as it being designed to do what is needed. So just by way of example, a little metaphor here. Let's say as a project team, you're tasked with replacing a legacy system. And in this example, this legacy system is represented by this king carrier chair. It's called I just looked this up before the presentation, it's called a sedan or a litter. I did not know that. So an initial expectation of a stakeholder asking to upgrade this legacy system might be for it to be rebuilt with better materials, more features, more sturdy, more resilient, perhaps streamlined a little bit so it can be carried around faster, maybe lack of flaws, right? No splinters, more comfortable. But is that, and that is a quality improvement, but is it as big a quality improvement as could have been made? You have to ask yourself, why was this person given a king carrier chair in the first place? What questions did the builder ask? Obviously, the person had a need for transport, but was that need simply to get from point A to point B without exerting any effort? Or did they want to, do they have bad knees? And the builder didn't ask the right question. So rebuilding something with a transformative functional design has the opportunity to vastly improve quality and increasing utility, not through simply upgrades, material upgrades, or in our case technology upgrades, but rethinking the functionality and how to solve the original problem. So this comes down to request versus true benefit. What a stakeholder initially asks for, and a stakeholder in this case is the person your project team is put in contact with to help design the system or design how to solve the problem. What stakeholders initially ask for may not be what you should build. Stakeholder requests are influenced by many things. They're influenced by old software, old processes, old habits, organizational habits or organizational culture. They're also influenced by assumptions about what's possible. They might be asking for something because they've seen their competitor do it, or they don't realize that there's a better way. Miscommunication between departments is also common. You might be assigned a stakeholder from a particular department and they can't adequately communicate the needs of other departments, or they're not aware of them. So what it comes down to is that business analysis determines the functional design of software, and this is so important because it's more than just the translation of stakeholder requests to requirements and specifications. Effective business analysis is not about being a scribe. It's not about being a documentarian. It's about working to being the active designer. And I would argue that it necessarily incorporates business improvement. Business analysis needs to be a key aspect of any technology project, even if there is no direct change in functionality. If you're just doing a pure upgrade, you have to be aware of the reasons you're doing that upgrade. Every project does have business value at heart and business improvement. It might be indirect, but there has to be line of sight there. And so what it really comes down to is that business analysis is a necessary activity to deliver quality. And we all want to deliver quality, and that's why it's important. Moving on to my second agenda item, how. So how is business analysis done? What are the methods? And also who? And that's the question I'm going to tackle first. Who does business analysis? Well, there's two sides of a spectrum, or two basic approaches. And this boils down to the question, is business analysis a role or is it a shared duty? On the left-hand side of my little chart here, I have traditional BA role, traditional business analyst role. And this is one approach. An agile business analysis is another approach. So who does the traditional BA role? Well, usually this is a dedicated team member or team members. It might be a role that that one person does part-time, shared with other duties. Maybe they're the PM, but it's a called-out specific role. Where do you find this? Well, you find this in IT departments. This is a pretty established practice, and so any larger or long-running IT department usually has someone whose job title it is BA as a job title. You find this in traditional consulting companies. This is a service offering of most larger or traditional consulting companies. And you find this in waterfall projects. It's almost necessary in waterfall software delivery projects. What is done under the traditional BA role? Well, the BA helps to define scope and requirements. They're seen as the communication conduit between stakeholders and developers. In many projects, stakeholders don't talk directly to developers and vice versa. They produce design documentation to hand off to developers, and they're seen as a stakeholder advocate. They represent stakeholder concerns in project team discussions if stakeholders aren't present. By contrast, Agile business analysis, every developer on the team performs business analysis under an Agile business analysis method. This is found on small Agile teams by choice, but also on lone wolf engagements where you have one person who's the jack of all trades. Maybe they are the developer and the business analyst and the project manager and the release manager all in one. So by necessity, you find this in some circumstances. And what is done? Well, hopefully many of the same activities that you find in the traditional BA role. Business analysis should and needs to be getting done to deliver quality. But the key aspect here is that there's usually not a lot of unnecessary communication overhead. Communication overhead in the form of documentation or in the form of formal meetings or in the form of emails. There's also developers can directly assess impact on code or infrastructure or technology. And so that's a definite characteristic of this. They are the people doing business analysis are those closest to the metal, so to speak. And one of the outcomes of every developer doing Agile business analysis is that you get barely good enough documentation. And that sounds like a bad thing, but it's actually what you want. You don't want unnecessary documentation. You don't want documentation that is too good or is too heavyweight. Less is more a lot of times when it comes to documentation, and you don't want to over-document too early in the process because then you have a documentation upkeep obligation that can waste time. So one of the main arguments for the traditional BA role is the communication conduit argument. On the left-hand side, you can see all the concerns or areas of expertise or areas of focus for a typical IT project stakeholder. And on the right, the same thing for a developer. All the areas of concern, all the things that they care about, all the things that they are experts in. And the argument is, if you put these two groups together, they have a fairly limited overlap in what is important in their respective worlds. So developers can talk to stakeholders and have meaningful conversations when it comes to, application screens or performance or deployments. Everyone knows what those things are. But one or the other side doesn't know or doesn't care or doesn't have the training to understand a lot of the other concerns of the other side. And the argument is that business analysis helps bridge this divide. It helps to increase the intersection, the shared language, and in that way can facilitate communication, help foresee indirect impacts of changing something that a stakeholder and a developer might not have thought to discuss. So the table a couple slides ago might have given you the impression that this is a one or the other type decision. You're either working on a traditional project or you're working on an Agile project. But my opinion is that that's not the case. This is a continuum. You don't have to decide which one you are. There's definitely characteristics of one side or the other. So in a traditional project, you might have team members with the title of business analyst that exclusively decide the functional design. So they work with stakeholders, they come up with the design, they document it, they dictate it to developers, the developers do it. On the other side, on an Agile project, you have most or all developers doing quote-unquote their own analysis. And this is analysis that's a prerequisite or a co-requisite to the development activities that they're doing at the time in their sprint. But there's middle ground here. So you might have a project that is mostly Agile, but perhaps you have one or two developers that specialize in analysis and they help the entire team. Maybe they help the entire team by contributing to all the analysis activities. Maybe they mentor other developers on appropriate methods to arrive at a functional design. Maybe they just help do some legwork. Trending more towards traditional, but still a little bit Agile, you could have a part-time but dedicated business analyst, so someone who's not a developer, but who is a business analyst specialist, work part-time on the project and help share analysis duties with the developers. So again, they're not the sole owner of the functional design. They're not dictating what it should be, but they're bringing some of some practices to bear and teaching or mentoring or just being a consultant or a contributor to the process. And the point here is that regardless of where you fall along the spectrum, and it is a spectrum, there's not sides, there's not one right way or the other, analysis needs to get done. If you're on the traditional side and analysis isn't getting done because you are overloaded with documentation obligations, or you have a person who's a business analyst who's run off their feet who can't dive deep into any one particular area, analysis isn't getting done. Conversely, if you're on the Agile side and you have all the developers that are just building what the stakeholder asks for and not focusing on analysis, making sure that that the stakeholder needs are truly being met, again, analysis isn't being done. So either approach could work, either point in the middle can work, as long as analysis is getting done. And what makes sense, where you fall along the spectrum, depends on so many things. There is an endless amount of project variables that could influence what the best approach for a particular project are. One of the major ones is whether you have the option of co-locating your software delivery team, your development team, with stakeholders. People who are put in the same physical space naturally collaborate and communicate better. And if you are in different rooms, different buildings, different cities, that is you're going to have to work at it. So it will come less naturally. Having a business analyst to facilitate that can help. The degree of project politics also plays a role here. If you have multiple projects at a organization that are vying for budget, or a sponsor who is not sold on the feasibility or the viability of a project, you might need a person or a mechanism in place to shield the developers from those concerns. And so a business analyst can play that role. The disposition and availability of stakeholders is also a big one. You might have stakeholders that are very busy, that don't have the time or the patience to talk to all developers, to collaborate with them. They might want a single point of contact, a person that they can hold responsible ultimately for the effectiveness of the design. And so that's a situation where you might not have the flexibility to move along that scale. And not ignoring the disposition of developers for whatever reason, whether it was just their personality or something they've learned along their career. Some developers prefer not to talk to stakeholders. This is something actually that as a software delivery professional you have control over. You can advocate for this. You can talk to your developers. You can encourage them to take on more duties to becoming a generalizing specialist and really improve their consulting skills. But it is something to take into consideration. The degree of non-functional complexity is also an important consideration. You might have a situation where you have a very complex legacy system that you have to do a code audit of, and you have to keep those developers in the zone, so to speak. You can't have them constantly context switching and jumping in and out. So I would argue that this is a fairly uncommon argument for a traditional BA role, but it's still a consideration. Client methodology and documentation standards. You might have a situation where you have a huge obligation to conform to a specific methodology or a specific set of documentation standards, and perhaps you have a business analyst that is well versed in that, and it just doesn't make sense from a time perspective to bring everyone else up to speed. And there's lots more. So there isn't a right answer, but my general recommendation would be consider moving down the spectrum towards Agile if you can. Take little steps. And I have seen firsthand how this can greatly improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of what you deliver. One of the biggest benefits of doing this is that it fosters a holistic sense of ownership. Developers are part of the process of coming up with the functional design. It's not dictated to them. They don't. It's not discouraging when changes come about. They are active participants in this, and I've seen that developers invite this challenge. They like to do this. They like to be part of the process. Tighter feedback loops and better collaboration. There'll be less lost in translation if you have developers talking directly with stakeholders and working through problems. And there might be some upfront rough patches, but ultimately if you get 2 or more people together, they're going to understand work styles, they're going to understand communication styles, and they will start working as a team. No communication bottleneck. You don't have a business analyst who's run off of his or her feet, who is behind on their writing their designs, who goes on vacation for a week and work grinds to a halt, or you have to switch to bug fixing mode. And more resource redundancy is another major one. You have everyone who is capable of doing business analysis, which is a key aspect of software delivery. Again, if you don't have someone around who is the business analyst, you have other people who can do it. Decisions are made by those with up-to-date technology expertise. You don't have BAs architecting solutions in technology or prescribing that something should be done in a stored procedure because that's what they had experience with 5 years ago when it doesn't make sense for the project. So you're involving the people that know how to build this when you're deciding what to build. So that was my viewpoint on who should be doing business analysis, and I want to talk a little bit now about how to do effective business analysis, what the methods are. So my presentation agenda was organized why, how, and what, and that was on purpose. A little while ago I watched a TED Talk by Simon Sinek. It's fairly old. It's from 2009. It's called How Great Leaders Inspire Action. It's only 20 minutes. It's very easy to grasp. It's very engaging. I would recommend everyone watch it. And Sinek's model of starting with why, he calls it the golden circle, he applies it to leadership and marketing, but I find it's a useful way of thinking for any kind of complex collaborative activity, which software development definitely is. And the general premise is this. The standard way of thinking, a natural way of thinking, is to start with the concrete, what's in front of you, what's in front of your face, and observing that and trying to understand it. And in trying to understand it, your thinking might elevate to how. So I see what's in front of me, I want to understand how it works. And then if you look at it long enough or dig a little deeper, you eventually get to understand why it is the way it is, or maybe you never do. And Sinek's insight was that if you force yourself to reverse this sequence of thinking, if you jump directly to the why, you start with the why, it's much more powerful and you quickly come to insight a lot quicker. Once you understand why something works, you can immediately or maybe even subconsciously eliminate theories about how or what. If you understand the goal of something, the how and the what comes a lot more naturally. And so there's real power in focusing on the why. So that's a theme of how you do effective business analysis. You always ask why. You ask why 3 times. You ask why until it's uncomfortable. You get to that kernel of why you're doing something or why it's important. And so how you do it, there's endless amounts of documentation on business analysis methodology. And I promised you at the beginning of the presentation I wasn't going to train you on a methodology. I'm just going to introduce you to some high-level ways of doing things that I find useful. And this you could consider this, a top 10 or a bare minimum of very effective but easy to do methods for conducting business analysis. And there's 4 general categories of activities here. Understanding the current state, coming up with user stories or coming up with the scope, the inventory of what you're doing, modeling, and documenting, detailed design. And so I'm going to jump into each of these in turn, but before I do, we like to be iterative, so this isn't a one-way street. You can go back and modify your understanding or the conclusions you came to in any one of these phases. And in fact, if you're delivering software in an agile way, this will be necessary. You won't be able to do all of these things in one sprint. So how this roughly breaks down between how and what, we're in the how section of the presentation right now. But the first 3 are generally how you do business analysis, and the last is what, what you ultimately write down. But the focus on why should pervade all of this. So you should always be asking why or tracing things back to the why question that you established or the why reason you established. So first, understanding the current state. There's 3 things that I find useful here. Stakeholder interviews is the biggest one. Other things that you can do to understand the current state of the business or the software that you're replacing, upgrading, improving, is to use those existing systems or be a participant in those existing processes. And then to review data repositories. The type of software, at least that I have experience with, is very data-driven software. So understanding the data I find to be a fundamental mental prerequisite to understanding the current state. But I'm just going to talk about stakeholder interviews. So I find that same room is better than webcam, is better than phone, is better than email, is better than passing documents back and forth. So you need to empathize with the person. You need to communicate with them in the most immediate and best way available to you. This isn't to say that you can't do this over the phone if your circumstance eliminates any of the better options, but always push for a better option. Always try to be in the same room. If you can't be in the same room, there's usually not a reason why you can't at least have a webcam in front of you. Walk through the current business processes and challenge the stakeholders and continually ask why. So this can get to be uncomfortable. It takes discipline to always ask why, and don't take a non-answer for an answer. There's nothing passive about this activity. It should be more work for you as a person performing business analysis than it is for the stakeholder. You want to use phrases like, help me understand, I might be missing something, but is this true? You want to summarize and talk and summarize back to them to make sure that they that your understanding is correct. Some pitfalls that I have fallen into. Resist the urge to think like a developer. I started my career as a developer, and it's very natural to want to solve a problem as soon as you hear about it. And that sometimes short circuits the part of your brain that really needs to engage to understand the problem. So understand how the business really works, not how you would like it to work, not how you wish it worked so that you could use this particular technology to solve it. Think critically, don't be critical. There are many business processes out there that you might be analyzing that on the surface look horrendous, but there's actually very good reason why they've developed the way they have. So always, again, ask why and think critically, but don't condescend an outwardly poor or inefficient process. And force your stakeholders to distinguish between urgent and important. It is so common or so natural, I guess, for stakeholders to focus on things that are recent in their minds, things, a problem that occurred in the morning, and they will use that as they'll consume the whole interview discussing that one problem. That might be such a small part of their business process. Everything else works wonderfully. And if you only focus on solving that one problem and you don't focus on improving the other 95%, the other 95% is going to be a problem after you deliver your project. So use those words. Say, is this urgent or important? And make sure that your stakeholders understand the difference. So the next phase of method here that I find useful is user stories. And the general format of these is a sentence. As a blank, as an actor, I want something so that something. Why are these important? Well, they establish the scope and they drive the work. There's not a software project out there that has not had some form of user story or requirement or high-level scope item This is necessary. This is the picture of what you're doing. But what I find useful about the user story approach is that it not only defines what, but it puts a focus on who and why. And just by way of example, why that's important. Here's a sample, traditional, high-level requirement. The intranet must allow employees to view their search history. Okay, that's fine. That's pretty clear. By simply rewriting this as a user story, you gain a lot more insight. So here's attempt number 1 at rewriting this. As an employee, I want to view my internet search history so I can retrace past successful searches. So the important addition here is the second half of the sentence that explains why this is important. And so this might influence the prioritization of this requirement. It might also influence the way you design the solution. You might, for example, decide to tag searches in the history that resulted in someone clicking on a result because it's important to retrace successful searches. If the user story equivalent of the high-level requirement ends up being this, you maybe have a completely different set of concerns. So as an employee, I want to view my internet search history so I can remind myself what I was working on last week in order to fill out my timesheet. Well, that's very different, and knowing that might help you prioritize this user story or deprioritize this user story to the end of the line if you know that that's the only reason or that's the primary reason why search history is important. So how are user stories done? They have to be written cooperatively with stakeholders or by stakeholders. It's a very easy format to learn. You can train your stakeholders and have them write these user stories themselves. If you are writing them cooperatively, use simple and inclusive tools. So index cards and projectors and word processors, something that is inviting, something that the stakeholder already understands. You're not imposing a new tool on them or a heavyweight process. You want to keep them simple. They'll be fleshed out later. So just, single sentence. And don't forget to include non-functional considerations. Just an example there, a non-functional user story or a user story with a non-functional component might be, as the head of sales, I want to approve quotes on my mobile device so quotes aren't delayed when I'm out of the office. So the non-functional consideration there is the fact that he or she is doing it on a mobile device. So what? As I mentioned earlier, a user story is basically a sentence. As a blank, I want blank, so that blank. It's very similar to a high-level requirement. It's also important to include a priority and a relative estimate. So priority might be 1, 2, 3, must have, nice to have, not needed, and a relative estimate. This doesn't have to be an implementation time estimate, 24 hours. It can be simple, medium, complex, small, medium, large, that sort of thing. Modeling. So we're going to talk about screen mockups, data model sketches, and flowcharts. Why is modeling important? The goal is to optimize the functional design. You want to maximize the team's understanding of the design that you decided on, and you want to maximize return on time investment. So this isn't a person sitting at a computer using a piece of modeling software. This is a collaborative activity. Stakeholder involvement is absolutely necessary. You're going to have different levels of models that you do, and some stakeholders are going to be more compatible with certain ones. But if you're modeling your software system, the functional design of your software system without stakeholder involvement, you're doing it wrong. If you're not involving them in the process, if you're just coming up with candidate designs and getting them to approve or reject them, that is not ideal. Include other developers and testers. Testers is a big a big opportunity here. Testers think in terms of edge cases or testability, and you want to make sure that that perspective is well represented in your designs. And what you're doing here is you're really unpacking the user stories. You're taking that initial statement that encompasses the who and the what and the why, and you're designing the solution to it. This is where the inspiration comes in, and it's hard to explain how to do this well, like how to be inspired to do this well, but I can certainly describe the conditions that have set me up for success in this activity. And again, you want to focus on the achievement. You want to focus on the why. Is your design the best approach you can think of to fulfilling the reason why that user story exists? How? So much like developing user stories, you want to use simple, inclusive tools and methods. So you want to use whiteboards, you want to use projectors and word processors. You want to sketch things out. You want it to be informal. You want to build flowcharts and simple data models. And if your stakeholders don't understand data models, sketch things out in terms of denormalized data tables with sample data. Most stakeholders have worked with Excel. They understand data relationships when they're written out in that way. And examples are so important. You might establish what you think is a shared understanding of how something should work, and then when you run through an example, it either tweaks something in someone's brain or you realize that you didn't actually have a shared understanding of it. What does modeling result in? Well, it doesn't result in formal documentation. Its primary purpose is establishing a shared understanding. You want to be as efficient as possible in this phase because you will necessarily throw out ideas. So you don't want to set in stone or spend a whole lot of time documenting your initial ideas. You want to fail early and fail often to iterate to get to the best idea. So that being said, it's not uncommon or improper to store the output. But these should be considered informal artifacts. They are memory triggers, pictures of a whiteboard, the word processor notes that you collectively hammered out, examples. You can assign questions and homework if it doesn't make sense for the whole team to hunt down a particular answer. You can assign that out. And what you really get is fleshed out detail on user stories. So a shared understanding of how a user story should be designed and developed. And just some examples here of the project I'm currently working on. So here's a picture of a flip chart where we have a little state transition diagram at the top, or process flow. We have a sketch of a table on the user interface and some arrows indicating what changes when certain states change, some example data at the bottom. Here's another example of a word processor document that we brought up in a boardroom with some stakeholders, and we took a screenshot of the app. We highlighted what we were talking about. We punched out some notes. We created a table with some example values at the bottom and highlighted which are good and which are bad. Here's an example of a really rough logical data model, crow's foot notation. So that's a very quick overview of the methods that I find useful for performing business analysis, and then it comes down to what. So what do you actually write down? What do you formalize in terms of documentation? This is your detailed design. So use cases are documented sequences of interactions between actors. They have a title, a precondition, a postcondition, steps, alternate steps. You can look up online how to document use cases. I just wanted to point out that I find use cases important. I'm not an advocate for no documentation. Certainly, you need to formalize some things. business rules, anyone who's worked on a major software system is familiar with documented business rules. These are statements of constraint or calculation rules or policies that can be programmatically implemented, and I have some examples here. And they're documented not just to facilitate development, but testing and maintenance as well. So they have to be kept up to date as your design evolves. And then the most interesting category of detailed design that I find is this bucket of miscellaneous documentation. And really you can apply some discretion on what makes sense for the particular thing you're designing. This is just some ideas of what you could provide to help get your point across. Illustrative examples, sanity check statements, so saying the same thing in a different way just to make sure that the language that you used in the documentation of a particular business rule isn't the source of misunderstanding. Data volume estimates. This is something that I'm bad at, but am proud when I actually remember to do it. So in the course of performing analysis, you generally get a sense of how much data is going to flow through this particular feature or be saved. And so providing an estimate or writing down an estimate, even if it's order of magnitude estimate, can really influence how the design and what makes sense, how much thought on performance needs to be applied up front. Pseudocode is useful if that's the way you think. It's not very useful, I find, if it's the only form of documentation. Pseudocode is not unit testable, so it's very likely that you have logic flaws in it. So you can use it to get an idea across, but augment it with sanity check statements or examples. And then the last thing that I like to do is to identify opportunities for logic reuse. So for example, if you have a calculation that appears on both a report and a screen, note that down so that when it gets time to develop it, you know to push that logic further down in the stack so you can reuse it. So I just have some examples here. I'm going to go through them very quickly, but they will be in the recorded presentation, and you can have a closer look if you like. So here's just an example I gave or I wrote down when deciding how rounding should work when dealing with tax and the inherent complications with that. This is a combination of business rules and examples and sanity check statements. Here's a visual representation of how certain things in a seasonal process work. I could have written this just out as business rules, but the visual representation acts as a sanity check and helps get people who have to collaborate and talk about this on the same page. Another example that I used visual indicators and a Gantt chart for describing a feature that was time sensitive, and just an example of a data volume estimate. So that's the end of my presentation. And so I just wanted to say that if you've had trouble hitting the mark on projects, or if you feel like you're investing a lot in documentation or a lot in process and you're not getting a whole lot out of it, if the results aren't as good as you expect, or you just want to try something new and you like what you've heard, I encourage you to try some of these suggestions. Go through the presentation again and maybe pick one or two things that you want to try next week or next project. If you'd like some help getting started, I'm happy to discuss it with you. I'll bring up my contact information in a second here, and I'd be happy to converse over email or phone, and we can talk about your specific project or project team or problem. Or if you have a project that you're interested in engaging DevFacto for, go to the website and you'll find our contact information there. So thanks, everyone. I will open it up to questions here. So if you have any questions, just type them out in the chat window and I'd be happy to answer them. Sorry, I've gone over time here. So we have one question here. So a question from Ivan. Your presentation focused on the BA role on solution implementation projects, but what is your take on effective business analysis as it applies to business process mapping to improve business process efficiencies only? Yeah, so that's a good question and an important distinction that I didn't make. Thank you, Ivan. So I was using the term business analysis as many people do and as we do to talk about functional design activities on implementation projects. But really the term I should have been using was business system analysis. Business analysis is not IT specific or implementation project specific. Certainly there's a whole another set of practices that would be effective if your goal is business process reengineering or business process improvement. But a lot of the same principles apply. Keep it simple. I have done business process modeling using formats that are not very inclusive, so IDEF3, IDEF0, and it ends up being a hindrance rather than a solution. I prefer to just use simple flowcharts, box and arrow diagrams. That's what I would recommend. Lisa asks, hi, do you have more information on unit testing? Well, there's lots of resources online. Certainly, unit testing is a fundamental of software development. I would say if you're developing anything new today and you're not putting a focus or a requirement on unit testing, you're probably setting yourself up for, if not short-term pain, then long-term pain. Unit testing is so important if you want to embrace anything iterative or agile. You will never have time to fully regression test everything with every change you make, and so it's so important to have some form of automated testing. And the quickest or the first thing you should do is invest in unit testing. Question here from Rob. How many developers does DevFacto have that actually operate in a combination developer analyst? I'm a developer by trade and made the shift to PM and BA about 8 years ago. I think that beginner devs need time to evolve into this type of hybrid role. Certainly, yes. I would say that not all our developers are experienced enough or even suited to this sort of role. It's something we push all our developers to do, and others adapt quicker than others. It does take some time. What we try to do is put specialists on the team, whether they are developers who specialize or have an interest in business analysis, or other team members, testers, or business analysts that have that expertise. We try to put them on the same team and really encourage and push this idea that software is better when developers are generalists and are involved in most aspects of the project. Kara Midget asks, Cheyney, I've used a lot of the methods you have mentioned, but the one issue I'm concerned with business analysis is extracting information in workshops. How do you deal with effective business analysis in this setting? It's true. Eliciting information from some stakeholders is difficult. There can be any number of hurdles. You could have a developer that is apprehensive about being involved in a project because they think their job is going to change significantly, or maybe that you're going to introduce a system that eliminates their job. I find that you have to focus on empathizing with the user. You have to form a personal connection. I did have a slide in here about whether it makes sense to conduct interviews at a stakeholder's desk in their work area or in a boardroom. And I was going to suggest that you always try to do it at the stakeholder's desk. And I thought better of that because that might make some stakeholders uncomfortable. But I think that if you can gauge that the stakeholder would be comfortable with that, that goes a long way to empathizing with them, to get them to open up. Make sure that they are aware that you're trying to understand their job, understand why, have their best interests at heart, and just be understanding. You know, ask why, but ask why in with some humility. You know, you want to use phrases like "help me understand," or "I might just not be getting it, but can you explain this again? I'm sorry." You know, that is an art, and it takes some time, but just practice at it. Any more questions here?
All right, well, it looks like that's about it for questions, and we're almost at the end of our hour. So thanks very much, Cheyney, for coming on and doing this webinar with us today, and thanks to all of you for joining us.